So my name is Uriah Burke. I'm a doctoral candidate here in the philosophy department. And I'm going to talk about Zika. And I'm going to follow some pretty standard fare ontology moves. So what sort of motivated this project, right, was that I was taking a look at things like the disease ontology. And I realized just how crappy their version of Zika definitions are. And so sort of the project as a whole is to take these infectious disease ontology, no GMS, and mash them together a little bit and try and get a bit better of an ontology for Zika. So to give you an example of just how bad the disease ontology is, at least when treating Zika, right? As we just talked about before, just for a second, this bit right here is superfluous in terms of the definition. One of the reasons it's superfluous is that mosquitoes are not the only vector, right? So one of the vectors for transmission of Zika, it's been documented to be sexual contact, for example. So we know it can be transmitted sexually. So trying to include more and more vectors doesn't really stack up there, right? Another thing, right, is that the disease ontology doesn't have a section for the Zika virus. So it delineates Zika fever as a disease from the Zika virus, but it doesn't talk about what the virus is at all. So that's why I start pulling in the infectious disease ontology and OGMS. So kind of working through OGMS and the infectious disease ontology, it became pretty clear that there was at least 3 different entities that I had to really work through and identify, get good working definitions for as sort of the primary 3 entities, right? We've got Zika fever, Zika virus, the Zika disease course. And these pivotal entities, right, they're going to sort of make the big stacking effects, right? All my relationships are probably going to be dealing predominantly with them, right? And what sorts of issues are going to fall out of the various relationships I've been dealing with there. So here we have the disease course from IDEO. I start. It might seem a little off the ball or off kilter to start with the disease course. I started here because I found it the easiest actually to define, because it was done in terms of like the culmination of processes dealing with the Zika fever, right? So the various problems I encountered mostly came out of trying to really nail down where Zika fever goes and where Zika virus goes. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward definition. Right. So trying to nail down disease, right? Which Zika fever would fall under. We see that it ends up being disposition, right? It's pathological, if you will. So Zika fever is the actual disease, right? This is as opposed to the disease course. The differentiation that I used, right, is that it has its physical basis in the Zika infection disorder. Intriguingly, as you may have noticed, I haven't talked about that yet, right? So that's an extra entity that I realized I needed as I was trying to define these particular 3 particular entities, right? So over here again we have the classification IDO, right? And the really interesting bit is down here, right? What kind of disease it is. So oh, this is actually slightly out of order. My apologies. So before I get into my 4th entity, I want to talk a bit about the Zika virus, right? So the Zika virus ended up posing a bit of a problem with me, or for me, right? So how do I start differentiating it, right? It became pretty clear looking through IDEO that I should really start talking about it in terms of virins, or a virin as opposed to a virus. Something I noticed, if you can see it, fortunately it's kind of small, they use a plural term, they use S's, viruses, as opposed to virus. So if I was going to do some revisions, I might check that off there. So how do I differentiate the Zika virin as opposed to other virins? So I was looking at the influenza ontology, to try and pull some inspiration and get some sort of idea of what's going on here. Because it's sanctioned by IDO and OGMS, right? And the idea was that the the influenza ontology is also about a virus, right? It was the first publicly sourced one, the only one sanctioned by IDO that seemed to be about viruses. So that's why I started looking at it. Unfortunately, I didn't get much help from it. As you can see, this is a pretty bad definition. At least I think it's a bad definition. One of the reasons it's a bad definition, probably the biggest one, right, is that the differentiating factor is that it's about the Zika virus, right? So it's a virin about the virus, which doesn't make sense to me. It's circular, right? Using the term inside the definition. The other thing that was pretty interesting, if you open up the influenza ontology, that I thought was weird, they have different versions of the influenza virus, A, B, and C, and they have those listed as organisms, but not under viruses, which seems like a really weird placement.
That's a mistake.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything wrong with the definition, though, because they are telling you what a virion is.
Okay. Well, but virions are like the particular instances of molecules, right? So, I mean, they are talking about it in terms of particles, but they are differentiating the particles from other particles, right? The differentiation is the problem.
Okay.
So, so coming back to the slide that I skipped for a second, I ended up settling on this possible Zika variation virion definition, right? I think that, sort of thinking it through, the best differentiator that I could think of, right, ended up being genetic sequences, right? So it's going to end up looking something like this, right? A Zika variant is a variant whose DNA or RNA sequence matches the Zika genetic code. I'm using the term Zika genetic code here because, unfortunately, I can't fit tons and tons of strings of ACG, CG, yada, yada, yada on the slide. Also, I have no clue where I'd find it, right? I don't personally know any scientists who have the entire genetic sequencing of Zika virus on hand. So I'd be open to finding out where, if you know of anybody who would have that. I might pull from the genome ontology to sort of hash that out a little bit more. So a note I wanted to make about the Zika genetic code. This is the only, so far this is the only instance that I'm talking about, right? Because the particular sequence is an instance of an information artifact. Right? I'm sorry, not artifact. Information content. So as opposed to everything else, which I'm using general universal terms. So this is going to come back. So the Zika infectious disorder, right? This is my fourth term coming back, right? This was the one that I realized, oh man, I need this, right? While I was working out Zika disease. Right? And so the things that were apparent, obviously, it's not the virus or the virin. It's not the disease itself. It's not the disease course. But it's got to be a disorder, right? Which makes it a material entity. Right? So I ended up defining it in terms of the disease itself. So Zika fever. So it is the physical basis for Zika fever. This is a common thread throughout many disease-oriented ontologies, particularly the infectious disease ontology. Definition of a particular entity in terms of its sort of its relations to other entities. Right? So when I was looking through the IDO disorders, though, I realized that there seemed to be a bit of a problem, particularly with the definitions of the disorder, infectious disorder, and acute infection, right? Which, if you look at this slide, are parented, if you will. So the big problems, okay, come when we look at infectious disorder is listed as an infection rather than a disorder, right? That should be disorder. And arguably, clinical abnormality is already in disorder, so I'm not sure what extra work infection's doing. An acute infection is also interesting because it's talking in terms of the infectious disease course as opposed to the actual disorder. Remember, the disease course and the disorders are different, right? So presumably, if they're referring to or building off of particular relations as disorders, they should be building off the same relation. Right? It's because what holds of the parent should hold of the child. Right? So these are essentially some problems, as I said, I noticed with IDEO as I was sort of picking through and trying to figure out where my definitions should go. Right? So just some possible quick solutions to these. Right? The idea is pretty simple. We get rid of the abnormality, right? We get rid of, we start talking about disorders rather than infection, these kinds of things, already listed it out. So, got to talk about microcephaly. Microcephaly has got a huge deal with Zika. It's arguably the main reason that we are so enamored with Zika. I did recently read an article that was saying that the epidemic is starting to be over. I guess production of vaccine and preventative measures are starting to help with Zika. We haven't really done much other than that, apparently, but it's working well. So maybe I'm a little late. But microcephaly is the big deal, right? As a disease, if you will, we've got to give it sort of the same treatment. The big sort of issue that's different between microcephaly and Zika is that microcephaly doesn't have one particular organism that it's tied to, like a virus. Right? So just a little reminder for those of you who don't know what microcephaly is. Right? The phenomena that we're trying to talk about, capture here, is a developmental sort of stunting of the head, right? In infants in particular. The heads don't grow well. Right? And this could be caused for a variety of reasons. So I couldn't pull from the infectious disease ontology because they are dealing with infectious diseases. Microcephaly is not only an infectious disease, right? So I decided to talk about it in terms of diseases and disorders that were produced or defined through OGMS. So the sort of the big problem that I highlight here is whether or not this is an acquired disorder or a constitutional disorder. Particularly with diseases and genetic diseases, right? And as I said, this applies when you start looking at the differentiations and disorders under OGMS as well. So why is this a problem, right? Why is this classification an issue? Microcephaly, if we just understand it as the sort of shrinking of the head or lack of development of the head, could conceivably be produced both acquired and in a constitutional way, right? So presumably a Zika scenario whereby a virus inhibits the development or changes the sort of the cellular structure, DNA structure of the cells that are making the head grow, or the DNA that's making the head grow, that would be acquired. Versus a constitutional case whereby this is a genetic birth defect that happened through some random mutation in the cells when the child was being conceived or something, right? So conceivably, there are cases of both. We have recorded cases of both, right? So which is it? I ended up taking the route to just split them in two, right? Rather than talk about only one kind of microcephaly, I decided that sort of the best way to start differentiating them is to differentiate them by essentially their cause, right? So, some concluding questions, right? A few things I wanted to know. Am I really capturing two different kinds of phenomena? So we like to think of microcephaly as one kind of phenomena. It's just the lack of proper growth in the head. Yet, on my account, it has to be two different phenomena. That doesn't seem right. There seems like there's all sorts of disorders that we want to capture that, are caused by a variety of different scenarios, but yet, don't have this sort of distinction between acute or congenital or what have you. Right? Another thing, which is something I was struggling with a bit back and forth with myself, am I losing generalizability by making reference to the particular information content entity? Right? That is the Zika gene sequence. Right? So generally speaking, we like to build, unless we're talking about informatic issues, where we're tracking people, we like to make our ontologies, especially mid-level ontologies, about general qualities, right? yet I'm making reference to a particular individual thing, right? This might, one possible sort of issue that could arise there is like we generally think that when we talk about individuals, especially with things like processes, we need to start doing timestamping. Yet I'm not going to be doing timestamping because I'm trying to make a generalizable ontology here. My defense there might be that I'm not making any sort of cases for the processes that the individual information content entity is going through.